Would like to welcome everybody to today's discussion of seismic shifts, organized labor, and COVID's impact on the economy. We all know that the past year has been a very difficult one for working people. COVID not only has taken a terrible toll in terms of illness and death, especially among working people and their families, but it has triggered an acute economic crisis. For labor, this has meant job loss, it's meant income loss, it's meant increased danger on the job. But we are also at a moment of opportunity. The beginning of the Biden administration and Democratic control of both houses of Congress for the first time since 2011 has created a new opening for organized labor. The stakes are very high. A dozen years ago, when the Obama administration took office, amid a severe economic crisis as well, its failure to deliver meaningful relief to ordinary Americans contributed to the Democratic loss of control of the House of Representatives in the 2010 election, which effectively ended the ability to pass new legislation and arguably contributed to the political dynamic that ultimately led to the election of Donald Trump. Organized labor lost strength rather than gaining it during the Obama administration. This time, we have to do better. To discuss the challenges and the opportunities labor faces, we have two superbly qualified speakers, Heidi Shierholz and Mark Levinson. Both are academically trained economists, Heidi with a PhD from the University of Michigan and Mark from New School University. And both have spent virtually their entire careers directly working to advance the situation of working people. Heidi is the senior economist and policy director at Economic Policy Institute. From 2014 to 2017, she was the chief economist at the US Department of Labor. Early in her career, she was an assistant professor of economics at the University of Toronto. She's the author of I Couldn't Count Them, a number of articles, and her Twitter feed on economic developments is probably the most valuable single resource we have available to chart this, and I'm sure we'll be putting up a link to that in the chat. Mark is the chief economist of the Service Employees International Union. Before joining SEIU, he worked for Unite, AFA-CWA, and the UAW. He is one of the leading labor movement experts on a very broad range of economic issues, including trade, and often serves as the movement's representatives on various government panels and commissions. And he moonlights as the book review editor of Dissent magazine. Heidi, Mark, and I will talk for about 40 minutes. Then we'll open up things for questions from the audience. As Michael mentioned, if you have a question, please feel free at any time, you don't have to wait till the end, to submit it through the question and answer button that's at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And then when we get to that portion of the discussion, those questions and answers will be forwarded to us, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. So with those preliminaries out of the way, let's get going. And I thought I would start with a question primarily aimed at Heidi, but Mark and Heidi, please feel free to jump in on any of these questions whenever you feel like it. But Heidi, how is this recession different from our last one, which began in 2008, just before President Obama was elected? This time around, who's been hardest hit in terms of job loss and income loss? And what are the particular dynamics of the recession we're living through right now?
Thank you. And I'll just start by saying thank you. I'm absolutely honored to be here. This is a wonderful discussion to be having right now. I mean, all the time, but also particularly right now. This recession was very different than recessions that we've had in the past. As far as who, I mean, it's different in a million ways, but as far as who has gotten hit the hardest, it's been particularly different. So just to step back to think about what normally happens, typically in recessions, The first workers you see getting hit are construction workers, manufacturing workers. So they're not the lowest paid workers, and they tend to be disproportionately men right out of the gate. So everyone, even in normal recessions, men and women both lose jobs. People at all wage levels lose jobs, but there is not typically a super disproportionate hit at the very low end, and men are typically hit harder. That's not what we saw at all in this recession. This recession, the way it happened, with shutting down basically huge swaths of the leisure and hospitality sector, restaurants, bars, hotels, anything related to tourism, also personal services in, brick and mortar retail, those kinds of industries are disproportionately low wage industries. So this recession just slammed low wage workers. They're also disproportionately women and people of color. So we've seen women and people of color and low wage workers take a huge hit in this recession. And I think the bottom line is all recessions exacerbate existing inequalities, but this recession is doing that more than we've ever seen before.
Yeah, Josh, this is the first service sector led recession really in United States history, I think. And as you know, Heidi said, all recessions exacerbate inequality. This has been a more unequal recovery than any economic recovery in US history. So at the top, people have basically already recovered. And yet at the bottom of the labor market, it's just, brutal. And so the inequality that exists in this recovery and the bifurcated, nature of this recovery is really quite striking.
Well, given the particular nature of this recession, let's talk a little bit about what do we do about it and what the new administration is thinking about doing about it. Maybe I could start, maybe Mark or Heidi, from the point of view of workers and unions, as the new administration is taking power, what are the most pressing economic issues? What are unions, labor looking for from the new administration?
You want me to start?
Sure.
Okay. Well, there's so much that needs to be done. It's kind of daunting and almost overwhelming. But so immediately, we have to offer support for workers who have just lost their livelihoods. And we started out, when we shut down the economy, when the CARES Act passed with the $600 extra for unemployment insurance, almost a $3 trillion it was we actually initially threw a lot of money at this. We did it, we have a very inadequate system to provide relief, to try and provide relief through an unemployment insurance system, which was not really set up to deal with this a problem at this scale. A lot of people fall through the cracks, and we can talk about that more. But initially we did a pretty good job of supporting people, although millions still fell through the cracks. That didn't last long enough. Those comprehensive provisions expired after a few months, and then you saw the situation in terms of social needs and hunger and eviction was getting much worse. And then the economy started to bounce back, but you still had enormous problems. So the first thing that has to be done, we need to support people who have been impacted by the recession. through increased unemployment, through direct payments, through whatever means necessary. That's the first immediate need. We then have to reconstruct or begin to reconstruct the American economy. But before we get to that, I don't know, maybe Heidi wants to add something on the immediate needs.
No, I mean, we could go down the list of priorities, but I couldn't agree more. Like, the key challenge is the virus and what people are suffering as a result of that in the labor market. And so getting in control of the virus, everything that can be done to invest in COVID measures, and particularly vaccine distribution, that's core. And then in the meantime, until we get that vaccine widely distributed, making sure people have the relief that they need. That's just crucial. And wait, can I say one other thing that I just looked it up quickly because Mark, when you talked about the difference in the recovery and how it's just brutal for people at the bottom, it triggered this thought that I had about something that was an analysis that Lael Brainerd, who's a Federal Reserve governor, did. A couple of weeks ago, she announced that unemployment for the bottom quartile of workers is probably above 20%. Like, when we talk about the overall unemployment rate at 6.7%, it just masks huge disparities for people at different parts of the wage distribution. So that number hit me. And so I just wanted to make sure it got highlighted.
Well, one other, interesting impact on the economy, because this is a kind of service sector led recession, different parts of the country are hit very differently. Mm-hmm. So it's not just where the virus is worse is where the economy is worse. The economy is worse where the service sector plays a larger role. So, for example, in New York City, where the service sector, plays a very important role, New York City has been devastated. James Parrott at the New School, just put out some numbers. He estimates we're probably 700,000 jobs down from, where we were before, before this whole thing hit. And so there's also that disproportionate impact.
Sorry, I keep jumping in. I'll just say on that also, states that have a lot of tourism as a big part of their, like Hawaii is getting slammed, Nevada is getting slammed, and it's exactly what you just said. But any place that depends on tourism is just really, really feeling this, and workers there just need the relief until people can start being tourists again.
So let's get back to how we could get some of the things you were talking about done and what role labor might play in that. But let's also, maybe before we do that, talk about the longer term picture. Let's be optimistic for a second and say that some sort of relief program gets through fairly quickly. Nonetheless, the economy is in pretty bad shape. And, at least for me, I think for other people, I'm a bit haunted by the experience of the last big recession. When the Obama administration came in, it did launch a pretty big recovery program. It was actually overseen, of course, by the then Vice President, Joe Biden, that disproportionately aided the financial sector and the wealthy. And, it took years and years for the situation of working class Americans to begin to improve. Besides the human toll, of course, there was a huge political toll for that. What could the federal government do to revive the economy differently this time, so that beyond just immediate relief, that the primary beneficiaries are not the well-off and the financial sector, but more ordinary working folk?
Mm-hmm.
Well, from labor's perspective, the single most important thing we have to do to reconstruct the American economy is to shift power relations in the economy. We have to empower workers. Workers have to be empowered to capture their just share of a growing economy. That hasn't happened in decades, and we're reaping the consequences of that now. Now, what does that mean? And there's an obvious labor law reform part of this, but there's also an economic policy part of this. So for example, I think one of the top economic priorities has to be full employment. The goal of economic policy should be a job for everyone who wants a job. That's the number one economic policy, above the deficit, above anything else, full employment. When workers are fully employed, that empowers workers. They have choices. If the boss is abusive, they can go somewhere else. In tight labor markets, wages rise. In addition to that, we have to make it possible for unions to grow. The fact is, anyone in who's looked at this question carefully knows, in the United States, workers do not have the effective right to form a union. That has to change now. And to their credit, Biden the other day said it is the policy of the American government to promote unionization. This hasn't been said by a US president since Roosevelt. Obama never said it. Clinton never said it. I mean, this is extremely important. Now, they have to act on it. The politics are tricky. We have razor thin majorities in Congress, but there's nothing more important to reconstruct this economy than empower American workers. That means increasing unionization.
I can say a little something on the other. I 100% agree with everything Mark said, and then also the getting relief to the economy, stimulating economic activity is also key. And one thing related to that history with what happened in the aftermath of the Great Recession. So the American Relief and Recovery Act of 2009, ARA, that was the big stimulus bill, and it doesn't look big compared to what we're doing now, which is great for us now. It was bad then. But that stimulus bill wasn't terrible. It increased unemployment insurance. It had aid to state and local governments. It did things to help regular people. The problem was there was not nearly enough. And then Congress turned to austerity in 2010 when the unemployment rate was still over 9%. It was outrageous. The pulling back, not doing what we could do to actually boost the economy. That was the thing that made the recovery so weak, take so long, lead to completely needless suffering for millions and millions of people who stayed out of work for a really long time. I mean, just to put one number on that, we estimate that in the aftermath of the Great Recession, Congress not doing enough to support state and local governments, so that state and local governments had to turn to austerity because they'd seen big drops in their revenues. The federal government not doing enough aid there delayed recovery from the Great Recession by over 4 years. It's just this remarkable, huge mistake that we made. It does look like we have learned that lesson to some extent. We're doing more. The Biden administration is proposing a lot more. That's really good news.
Let me, the politics, both of you have alluded to it, are obviously quite difficult. I mean, essentially the Senate's evenly divided, very slim majority in the House. I guess a couple of questions about this. One, how much can the Biden administration do without legislation? I mean, there've been a flurry of executive orders, an enormous amount, I think 40 as of yesterday. Some of them are a little kind of symbolic. It's a little hard to read what they actually mean. I know, Heidi, you've had a lot of experience in the Department of Labor yourself. How much can the Biden administration address both the changes that the Trump administration put in place, overtime rules, NLRB decisions, 1,000 things, and can it go beyond where, is the best we can do just get back to where we were 4 years ago? Or can we actually move forward, given the political situation in Congress?
That is the question of the hour, right? Because we know that so much will be happening through the regulatory process. So there is a lot that can be done. The Biden administration is, as you said, they're already putting out executive orders showing what will be done. So a couple of the key things, and it touches on some of your points, the couple of the key EOs that they put out so far. One of them was directing the Department of Labor, the OSHA, the Office of Safety and Health Administration at the Department of Labor, to put in place an emergency temporary standard to protect workers from COVID. That will be super important to not just the workers who will be safer, but also to a successful reopening of the economy. The law gives OSHA the power to put in an emergency standard when there is a new threat to workers. The Trump administration never felt that that COVID actually rose to the level of a new enough or a big enough threat to workers that they had to put in an emergency standard. So there is nothing really in place that protects workers from the specific threat of COVID. So the administration doing that will make a huge difference. Another thing that they have announced that is related to wanting to go farther than not just return to where we were in January of 2017, is they have proposed or put an EO to have the Labor Department work on increasing the minimum wage for workers on federal contracts to $15 an hour. The executive branch can't increase the overall minimum wage. That has to go through Congress, but they can increase the minimum wage for workers who are on federal contracts. Obama actually did this. In 2014, they published a rule that increased the minimum wage for workers on federal contracts to $10.10. That was sort of where the social and political context of the minimum wage was at that time. It's totally different now. One of the reasons it's totally different is that the economics profession has changed. There's now no kind of consensus that a $15 minimum wage would cause any substantial job loss. There's been a whole shift. And now the Biden administration has put out an EO that they want to increase the minimum wage for federal contractors to 15. So I do see that and some other signals that there really is interest in not just undoing what Trump did, but going farther to meet this moment. And there's a lot that needs to be done, as Mark said.
Mark, maybe you could add to that. What about on the right to organize? I mean, there's such a history of failure at labor law reform, even with much stronger Democratic majorities than we have now. You go all the way back to Lyndon Johnson, and new administrations come in, high hopes, oh yes, oh yes, oh yes, and time it doesn't happen. And given the current configuration, it seems really hard to imagine labor law reform soon. So, is there anything administratively the Biden administration can do?
Well, I mean, there is a terrible history of failure on labor law reform, and it's not clear the politics are there. There is a very comprehensive proposal, the PRO Act, which would probably be the most comprehensive labor law reform since the 40s. We've also been pushing the idea of sectoral bargaining, which is not in the PRO Act, but which we think, the government, states and the government, can play a role in getting industries, getting companies to sit down with, unions and worker representatives to bargain for an entire sector, which would be an important mechanism to raise wages. But ultimately, we have to change labor law, and even if the politics, aren't there now, we have to make the case. The Democrats, have to make this a priority. In the Obama years, a decision was made to prioritize healthcare over labor law reform. Maybe that was the right decision, maybe it wasn't. But we have to, make a run at it because it's that important.
And let me just follow up, and either you could jump in on this. It's very striking, the union rhetoric coming out from the new president and the symbolism of embracing it. But actual labor leaders have been pretty invisible in the last week or two. We haven't seen a lot of them putting forth their programs or their agendas. And do you have a sense that labor has a presence in the decision-making discussions about priorities, legislative and otherwise, that they're taking on now? Because you wouldn't know it from the outside.
Well, I mean, I don't think that's quite true. I mean, definitely, if you look at the evolution of the Democratic Party on the $15 minimum wage, that was a labor demand from day one, and we've moved the whole party on that issue. Right now there's very difficult tactical discussions going on. So does the administration try and pass the whole $1.9 trillion program, or which is going to take longer? Do you try and do it in a bipartisan way? Do you do it through reconciliation? If you do it through reconciliation, what can be done through reconciliation and what can't? Or do you prioritize getting immediate support to families that that need it, and COVID relief? Do you COVID and checks? Do you prioritize those two things and then try and get the larger package later? And so it's a little unclear what's going to happen, but these are important tactical discussions that are going on right now. I mean, my own view is they should, people need help now. I would not, just because I don't trust Republicans, I would not try and go the bipartisan route. I believe Democrats should get what they can immediately, as soon as possible, through reconciliation, and then go from there. I mean, that's my own view.
I'm sorry, Heidi. Yeah.
I was just going to say one thing that just to underscore some of the urgency. The December $900 billion COVID relief bill that extended some of the pandemic unemployment insurance provisions, those expire in the middle of March. And that's we're going to blink our eyes and it's going to be the middle of March. And if Congress hasn't increased those extensions, millions of people will be thrown off of UI. We know that the virus will still be rampant at that point. The labor market will still be weak. So there is a one key deadline. They have to move, to get it, and to make sure that nobody gets thrown off or has to deal with the anxiety of thinking they're going to get thrown off in the middle of March. They sort of need to get it going by the middle of February, which is just around the corner.
It's interesting because one way to look at this is that we've kind of had an ad hoc experiment in a different unemployment system, in terms of both covering self-employed and gig workers and other people who would normally excluded, and in terms of the benefit level. I mean, in the spring, some people were denouncing unemployment because people were making more money on unemployment than they were had been on their jobs, which is a measure of how crummy their jobs had been.
God forbid.
Yeah, but we had kind of living wage unemployment system, and we also had a kind of experiment in guaranteed income with these lump sum payments. I mean, does this have implications for where we should, what have been their effects? I guess that's the first question. And then, should this be the new normal?
Do you want to go? I can go quickly. We actually, with the CARES Act, we actually implemented a very progressive social safety net system. It was remarkable. It made a huge difference. We're starting to be able to get data out from that period that we can analyze. But one of the things is in the second quarter, when we saw millions and millions and millions of people losing their jobs, poverty actually went down. It's just this huge testament to what we did to make sure that people were okay during that period. It alleviated a huge amount of suffering. Republicans in the Senate allowed a couple of things to expire at the end of July, like the extra $600 in unemployment insurance benefits. So it became much less good after that. But with the re-upping of things in December, it's not quite as good as it was originally, but it's better. We really have done remarkable thing. It's not perfect. Like when I look at the CARES Act, I can also list the things that are problematic about it, but overall, it really did provide just crucial relief at an extremely difficult time for working families. And it did show us that there's so much that we can do. Like getting people money actually works, and we can get it to them. So for example, this expanding eligibility for unemployment insurance to self-employed workers, it has gotten relief to millions and millions of people during this time. It's been bumpy. Like there's been difficulty in rolling it out. There's been problems in the system, but with the proper investment in those systems, what we have shown now is that we can do this. And so, I mean, those programs are set to expire, but I do think there is definitely renewed energy this has been a really clear example of how much good that sort of thing can do, and to help make sure we don't lose those lessons when this pandemic is over.
What Heidi said is really important. I mean, this is the kind of dirty little secret that, the right doesn't want people to understand. I mean, when you think about it, in the midst of the worst, economic crisis in a century, for a period, poverty went down because of social policy. And so it would be so easy in, quote, more normal times to eliminate poverty. And the kind of brief success, of the CARES Act shows that. And so properly constructed policy, comprehensive policy works. It's not that difficult. Just one other thing here. There's an interesting contrast to what happened when you look at the response to the crisis in the US compared to Europe. Europe didn't do, that great either, but one big difference, unemployment in Europe did not increase the way it did, in the US, because those countries essentially supported workers in their jobs. They subsidized businesses to stay alive and to pay their workers. So essentially they were keeping the structure of their economy intact. Here we had a very different model. We let millions of businesses die, workers are unemployed, and then we try and support them through unemployment insurance. There, at least in large part, much more so than here, they kept the structure of the economy intact, kind of realizing this is not a permanent change. This is a however long it's going to last, there's going to be a beginning, a middle, and an end to COVID. And there was something to be said for keeping, the economy, intact. But it was a very interesting difference in approach than what was followed in the US.
We are going through our time period pretty quickly. And before we get to questions and answers, there are two different questions I just want to bring up. Maybe the first for Mark and then the second for Heidi, which take us into slightly different areas. The first, Mark, is the issue of trade. I mean, one of the significant political and policy shifts under Trump was our relationship with other countries, particularly in the economic sphere, the trade wars, quite a departure from the Obama administration policies. I guess my question is, what next? How much does this actually matter to working people, and what should be our trade policy going forward?
Well, that's a big question. Well, I mean, the Democrats up to now, I mean, from the Clinton years, the Obama years, I think were very bad on trade. It was, you know, Clinton who signed NAFTA and the WTO. You know, Obama, you know, very much continued in that tradition, and you know, offered absolutely little or no support for U.S. workers who were, you know, thrown into direct competition with, you know, millions of workers around the world, most of whom, you know, had no rights to unionize or to to organize, and it just the devastation was, you know, was widespread. But so there's two things. We have to reject the kind of NAFTA WTO model of organizing a global economy, which essentially is organizing a global economy based on protecting the rights of capital. What the WTO does, what NAFTA does, is protect corporate rights to, you know, move production around the globe, protect their investments, and it does to date has done nothing to protect worker rights. That model is completely, you know, unacceptable. It's pro-corporate, it's anti-worker, it's failed workers in the advanced countries, failed workers in developing countries, and it's benefited capital enormously. So that model has to be rejected. And I think, and you know, like in a lot of other areas, the Biden people seem to recognize that. I don't think we're going to see, you know, new trade deals in this administration. We have to, you know, support American workers. We have to develop a much more comprehensive industrial, you know, policy to support American industry in today's global economy. But the other piece of the global piece requires a much more internationalist perspective, and that is in support of worker rights. And so if we're not raising the standard of living of workers around the world, if we're not, you know, lowering the gap between U.S. wages and wages in other countries, then the problem of runaway shops is not going to disappear. But we have to do it by raising the floor of the poorest workers in the world. Now, you know, Trump renegotiated NAFTA. There were new labor provisions put in NAFTA. I think we're soon going to see some test cases where unions in the US are going to be working with worker advocates in Mexico to see how effectively those provisions are going to be to, you know, make it possible for Mexican workers to form unions to raise their standard of living. But that's the kind of thing we need going forward. But the old WTO NAFTA model has to be, you know, rejected.
Some questions are coming in. Let me ask one final question. It's a slightly different area to Heidi. You know, last week, the BLS released the data on union membership for last year. It kind of got lost, I think, in the shuffle, given how many a million other things going on last week. But you wrote a really nice short little article that I found both really enlightening, and I was very surprised by the data that you discussed. Could you just sort of fill us in a little bit about what happened last year and what you think the significance is?
Yeah, the data were kind of mind-blowing, and I can put my little report in the chat, but here's the upshot. So 2020, it was union membership data for 2020 compared to 2019. BLS puts it out every year. The one overarching thing was 2020 was a terrible year for union members and non-union members alike. Like, there was massive job loss in 2020. But one key thing is there was less job loss amongst union workers than non-union workers. So if you look at the unionization rate, it went up. It went up non-trivially. It went up by 0.5 percentage point. So it was was very strange. Not strange, but it was an interesting dynamic that we saw. So this question of, okay, what made that happen? Why did union workers see less job loss than non-union workers? I did a little decomposition that breaks down that effect into two different parts. So one part is unions are actually really good at protecting jobs. Like unions worked with employers to negotiate furloughs, to negotiate work sharing agreements, that sort of thing. So that's one key thing, that union workers saw less job loss than non-union workers in the same industry. That accounted for about half of the increase in the unionization rate. The other half was more of a mechanical thing. I refer to it as the pandemic composition effect. It was the result of the fact that industries that saw a ton of job loss were low union industries. So like leisure, hospitality, it just got slammed in this recession. That industry has very low unionization rates. And then on the flip side, some very high or relatively high union industries didn't see as much job loss. And a key one there is the public sector. And I just want to be clear, the public sector lost a lot of jobs in the downturn. It was, and we need state and local aid. Like, I don't want to act like the public sector is fine, but the public sector lost fewer jobs than the private sector, which is a typical thing we see in recessions. The private sector or the public sector is relatively highly unionized. And so that just having that shift from lower union industries to higher union industries, just because of where the job loss was, that made up about half of that increase in unionization rates. So it was both things, but the upshot is union workers, everyone saw job loss in 2020, but union workers saw less job loss than non-union workers.
It was still very startling to see the union, I guess it's the percentage of workers represented by a union, jump by 0.5 point, and I don't remember the last time we've seen a 0.5 point increase. You have to go, so, thank you for explaining why. And I guess it doesn't necessarily, well, in some ways it does reflect the strength of the union movement. In other ways, it doesn't. There have been a bunch of questions coming in from the audience, and let me ask a few, and I'm going to be doing a little bit of paraphrasing here, so I hope the questioners don't mind. One person asked, okay, full employment, what's the best way to do it? Do we revive Humphrey Hawkins? Is there some other approach? And let me add a piece to that. A lot of the discussion in terms of stimulus has been about infrastructure as a job creation mechanism, but that does tend or might tend to skew towards white men, given their disproportionate representation in the construction industry. So, what's the program towards moving towards full employment?
Well, I'll go first and then you jump in, Heidi. So there's several components. There needs to, so the government has to take responsibility for full employment. That means whatever the private sector is not employing, government has to fill in the gap. And it can do that in numerous ways. So, we need massive infrastructure investment, roads, parks, schools, irrigation systems, travel infrastructure. I mean, our country's falling apart. And this is not a short-term program, by the way. This is a years-long, decades-long investment program that that needs to be done. That's one component. But it's not just infrastructure. We need a massive public investment in what a lot of people call care work. So, the importance of child care, elder care. We way underinvest in those areas. And so a public approach to, raise the levels, raise the compensation, guarantee access to both elder and child care would also create a lot of jobs. And of course, the third area is in the Green New Deal. And, there is this is not a longer term program. This is an immediate need. We need to act now. But to do what we need to do, we need to refashion our energy sector. We need to create new sources of energy. This is new jobs. It requires investment. And so all of those things will increase employment. And the fourth, infrastructure, care work, Green New Deal, the fourth component of full employment is we need to go back to a public jobs program, I believe. So whatever whatever unemployment exists after we do all of those things, if we still have workers who need jobs, they should be public jobs, meeting social needs until we reach full employment. And historically, in the 30s and 40s and up through the 70s, we had public jobs programs. People forget that even under Jimmy Carter, we had 800,000 people in public jobs. And so, but, and yet in the 2008 crisis and this crisis so far, it hasn't really been talked about. Well, it's starting to be talked about actually as part of a COVID response. But anyway, those are I think the components of a full employment program.
I can add just I love that your delineation to the public investments that we need to create the economy that we want, things that aren't being met by the market. And so we need government investments in them. I would also add to that education. We can do a ton more in pre-K and K through 12. And that's just, those resources pay off in future productivity. And it's just win, win, win. And then the other thing that this health crisis has shown us is greater investment in public health would be a key thing. If we had, yes, right. I was just going to say, we didn't have the setup to be able to do the kind of widespread contact tracing that would have been incredibly helpful in keeping the virus at bay. And so getting stuff in place so that we have people that are doing good public health work all the time, but that can then be motivated or can then be mobilized in a crisis like this one would be a really important investment.
Another question, I guess in a way it was kind of pushing back a little bit on Mark's discussion of the difference between European approaches and US approaches in terms of funneling money to existing businesses to keep workers employed as opposed to letting them get unemployed and then trying to help them. And I'm paraphrasing, but basically the questioner asked, well, if you funnel money to existing businesses, aren't you basically using the state and public finance to maintain a system that's kind of failing workers, that's unequal, and how do we avoid? And you could argue the whole recovery program in 2008 in some ways did that. How do we avoid the twin traps on one hand of having people lose jobs, on the other hand, simply using state resources to further cement a system that failed before COVID?
Well, obviously, if you're giving, you can't just give the money to businesses, carte blanche. There have to be conditions, and the money should come with conditions, and the conditions should be, one, they have to obviously maintain employment levels, but you could create other conditions. You could also make the money conditional on the fact of respecting the employees' right to unionize. You don't get a public subsidy unless you are meeting public values. Now, I'm not saying they did that in Europe. They kind of just more maintained the employment relationship, which has its own value compared to just throwing people out of work and then giving them temporary unemployment insurance, which could run out, at any time. Businesses rely on government for a lot, and government to date has not made that support conditional enough. in my view, on meeting, social values and social needs. And there's no reason, why we couldn't do that.
Let me connect to this a separate question, but I think in a way it is kind of related. Some member of the audience said, look, they were very surprised by the behavior of these retailers, who of course have done extraordinarily well economically during the crisis, and that, many of them, like Amazon and others, instituted heroes pay or hazard pay or things like that, in the early months. And then, by the summer, a whole bunch of them dropped it. I don't know, the hazard didn't seem to go away, but the pay went away. And, they were saying they were surprised, in a way, how did they get away with it? But also, why hasn't there been sort of more of a kickback against this? It's not something that seems to have, generated a lot of public outrage or labor activity or so forth. It does seem like a kind of measure of the weaknesses right now of labor forces. And I'd be interested in your comment and also, besides things that the Biden administration might do, how does labor rebuild, its ability to address outrages like that?
I can take a first stab at it. One thing we know is that recessions totally erode workers' economic leverage. When your employer knows that there's like a queue of people looking for your job, if you leave it, then they just don't have to pay as well. And so that's like during this downturn, when employers took away hazard pay, workers don't have outside options. And so that takes away their power to fight back. And so that's one of the reasons that strong relief to get us back to low unemployment quickly is super important. I do know that unionized workers were able to secure more provisions in the way of hazard pay, unsurprisingly, but the recession really does weaken workers' bargaining power. So an answer to that is, let's get this economy back to low unemployment. And then in the longer run, to deal with those outrages, to me, it means we need really strong standards in place, and we need those standards really well enforced. Like, we need to raise the minimum wage. We need to make sure workers have safety protections. We need to put all the things in place to guarantee some key measure of job quality. And then not just put those things in place and leave it, we have to enforce them so that employers have a real financial incentive to actually follow through and comply with strong standards.
Yeah, one consequence of the Trump years and even in the decades before, I think our side has been, beaten down. Our expectations, our expectations are like way too low. We accept many things that are just unacceptable. And so, again, the administration can change a lot of that, and use the bully pulpit to call out corporate bad actors and to say, no, we're not going to, like, for example, Biden. One thing Biden said, again, it got kind of passed over as so many things are happening, but he made the statement that that workers should have the right, or workers should be able to receive unemployment insurance if they choose not to work in what they consider a dangerous environment. I mean, that's so commonsensical. It should be the law of the land. It's not. So you had meatpacking workers in the Midwest forced to go to work in virtual death traps, and the governors of those states saying that they were not going to pay unemployment insurance for workers who didn't show up, and that is just that's criminal. And so Biden making that statement is important. Now they should implement it. That should be like an emergency, law of the land, and as part of COVID.
I think we have time for one final question, and again, I'm sort of paraphrasing it, but one questioner sort of comment that they thought perhaps under COVID there was an increase in part-time and sort of temporary and short-term, employment. Everyone's hustling around the best they can to put something together. And I guess the question is, what are the implications of that? I mean, if that's true, and I'm not even sure if it is true, it's clearly an extension of a longer trend away from, a standard job. I mean, the days when people work sort of 9 to 5, 5 days a week, it seems like, like the Middle Ages. We've been moving away that for a long time. But as that increasingly accelerates, what's the implication of that for labor policy, both from the point of view of government and from the point of view of the labor movement itself?
That's a really good question. I can take a stab at it. One thing that the data on, what kind of workers have been hit hardest, some of that is a little delayed on as far as different kinds of contingent arrangements that we don't have good up-to-date data on at all. But one thing we do know is that there are a lot of workers, millions and millions of workers who've kept their jobs, but have seen their hours and pay drop as a result of the pandemic. So in various ways, we know that workers, even those who have managed to keep some employment, are really suffering. So I don't have the silver bullet to that. I loop back around to the things that we need to do are get us back to recovery in the labor market, so people can get, like as Mark was talking about, that the stronger labor market will increase wages. Obviously, people will be more likely to have jobs, and then strong standards and unionization to help increase the quality of those jobs. So taking it from both those angles is sort of the two fronts that are crucial to making those changes.
Yeah, I mean, just saying. In response, in New York City, for example, the only jobs that have grown since COVID are delivery jobs, mm-hmm. And I don't even think we know the exact number, but that is a pretty stark fact. Mm-hmm. That the one sector of the economy that has grown since COVID hit is delivery jobs, and these are contingent, no benefits, low wage, and it's an area where, again, government should step in and raise the standards by law.
Right. Well, I think we are almost out of time. Let me just ask either of you. We covered a lot of ground. There's so much more we could cover, but any final thoughts you want to throw in?
Well,
yeah, go ahead.
I'll just say, the crisis is so severe. We've been through an incredibly traumatic, political experience. The Biden administration, I have to say, the appointments in the economic and labor area have been superb. I think it's fair to say the appointments in the economic and labor area would be very similar to what they were if we had a Bernie Sanders or an Elizabeth Warren, presidency. And I think that speaks to the, strength of the movements that were behind those candidacies. But we have to keep pressing. But they're off to a good start. I think we've learned a lot of mistakes from the past, but we just have so much to do.
I'll just echo that, and I'm not always the most optimistic person on what will happen with policy, but this administration is giving me every reason to be optimistic. That, like the relief and recovery package, the 1.9 trillion that Biden proposed, that is a package at the scale of the problem. It is just a remarkable shift from where we've been in the past. Mark made this point earlier, and it's very much worth emphasizing. We all have to keep pushing. We have to demand that they follow through with the things that they have put on the table so far. But they're on the table, and that's incredibly important.
Well, on these, well, I actually have to call unusually optimistic notes, given the experiences we've all been going through, not just in the past year, but in the past decade. I would like to thank very much Mark Levinson, Heidi Shearholtz for joining us in what I think has been just a terrific discussion. I want to thank the whole staff at the School of Labor and Urban Studies that makes this possible. And I would like to thank you, our audience, for joining us in what's been a terrific session. Thanks, everybody.